The American question. What is it? What's happening? Where are we going? Irvin Studin here, Editor-in-Chief and Publisher at Global Brief Magazine. Thanks again for joining us for this micro lecture. Thanks for all your great comments, your support, your critique as well. Keep subscribing, keep pushing the discourse. I'm speaking as a complete outsider here to the American condition. I live in Upper Canada. I'm a Canadian. Whenever I travel or speak about other countries that are not mine, I speak with great humility and I try to be as respectful as possible. It is not my country. However, the American condition is close to mine. I observe it with great keenness and with some ken, having lived in parts of the United States, having worked in great American companies, having family in the United States, having traveled extensively across the United States, and like most Canadians, indeed many people around the world, having great friends and colleagues across the United States, I have to say that we are inhabiting today what historians, I think, 50 years from now will call the age of the degenerates. We are living in a period of deep political degeneracy, particularly in the leading democracies of the West. Let me exclude Canada for the moment. If you look at the behavior of the leadership in the United States, whatever one's political party, and again, I'm an outsider, I have no political party, even domestically I have no political party, and if you look at the leadership of the United Kingdom, we are living in an age of political degeneracy. Which country on earth, which society, which people in the world is saying to itself, oh, would that we would behave, would that our leadership would behave like the leadership of the United States today? Or would that we could do as the Brits are doing it today? These are politically degenerate examples that confuse the democratic world and also confound the non-democratic world, where many intellectuals, many leading thinkers are actually saying, look at the terrible quality of leadership we have in the Western countries. Now, what kind of leadership is this? These are not just weak leaders. These are leaders that are not serious people. And what do I mean by serious people? Serious people are, and serious leaders are those for whom consequences have great costs. That is, there are great and serious felt consequences to serious mistakes. Not zero consequence to degenerate behavior or degenerate decision making. And unfortunately, the greater our physical and temporal removal from the great calamities of recent history, starting with the Second World War, but several wars thereafter, the greater our distance from felt consequences. And this seems to be a leading explanation, at least outside of the West, for some of our degeneracy today. We have degenerate leaders in the leading democracies because they don't have a serious sense of the consequences of terrible behavior and decision making. So that being said, let me walk through some of these terrible moments that we're inhabiting, particularly in the United States, and try to explain them. And in future lectures, I'll try to distill some ways out. In a separate micro lecture, subsequent to this one, I'll speak to the Canadian response and what it should be in particular. And indeed, in the Canadian context, what happens if Trump should win a second term? What kind of pressures will be borne by Canada, and how ought it to respond? How ought other countries to respond to such pressures? And I would call them, in many cases, degenerate pressures. But the American condition is unique because I'm a big admirer. America is one of the great, indeed, I would say the great civilization of the last century and a half. It is a term-setting country in business, in culture, in science, of course in politics and international affairs. In the English language, it's a term setter. In literature, I'm one of the biggest consumers and admirers, and hence my great sadness and devastation at the degenerate condition of the current both leadership and direction of the United States. So let's start with some conceptual points. Before Trump was elected, I was in the contrarian minority saying Trump could likely get elected. That was purely a contrarian bet on my part. I was successful in the bet, but unsuccessful in suggesting afterwards that he would not last the entire first term. He may yet not last the entire first term. But I thought it would end in tears. My biggest mistake was in saying that the two bookends of the Trump presidency would be war on the one hand and a Nobel Prize on the other. And let me explain myself. These aren't absurdities. War because of capricious decision-making or war by theater, both of which may obtain yet. Watch the Iranian situation, or even watch the Ukraine-Russia situation. In many cases, their war may yet obtain in the last year and a half of the Trump presidency. But on the other hand, I said, he might win a Nobel Prize. Why might he win a Nobel Prize? Not because he's a great peacemaker or he has the greatest intentions, but because of the rule by Capris. His imagination and his ability to maneuver will be off the charts, that it will be non-path dependent. He may be able to engineer some peace deals and some important game-changing peace deals, between quotation marks, by the way, an expression I don't quite like, very kitschy. Game-changing peace deals because he's inhabitual. And so it was almost the case with North Korea. So it could still be the case in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, although we're clearly moving from that. So it could still be the case in the Middle East. The problem is, between these very extreme bookends, which are the direct opposites of one another, war, Nobel Peace Prize, I forgot the missing part, which explains much of the world's reaction to the Trump presidency and the American leadership today, is that in order to either engineer an important war and be successful with allies, or indeed to win a Nobel Peace Prize, or maybe a Nobel Prize of any species, one has to have trust. And in rule by Capris, that is, I feel like doing A one day and I feel like doing B the other day, trust erodes. And who in the world would trust the current American leadership today? Nobody. Only a degenerate leadership outside of America would trust the American leadership, sign anything, or agree to be their trusted ally, or expect that they should defend one's country in a pinch. Forget the Kurdish example, which is the latest manifestation or betrayal of Capris. There is a NATO pressure, there's a pressure in the Arctic, there's a pressure between Ukraine and Russia, there's a Middle Eastern pressure more generally. Who would trust the American leadership today? This trust will take an extremely long time to rehabilitate, and it certainly won't happen under the current presidency. So deterioration of trust is one of the grave degenerate consequences of American leadership today. Let's talk about the second one, language. How do we speak in America at the political level today? Forget the degeneracy of the tweet vernacular, or literature by tweet, or 30, 40 characters, whatever the bandwidth may be. Look at the vernacular of rhetoric. It is all Facebook or Twitter language, which in the end devolves to nothing. Words like troubling. What does troubling mean? The leadership is troubling. That behavior was troubling. It means nothing. Right? And over time, it's intended either to stop conversation or to confuse the consumer, the public. Shocking, disturbing, and all adverbs added on to those adjectives in the end become degenerate. They mean nothing. Stunning, shocking, bad actor. All of these things have no more resonance in the English language in terms of conveying a clear message and even connoting a coherent course of action thereafter. So the American leadership is not only degenerate today in terms of the trust that it has largely eroded amongst its various stakeholders around the world, but also in terms of the language it uses, the debasement of language, Facebook language, Twitter language, and degenerate language in rhetoric that has no meaning at all. So how are you to recover any sense of standing or trust if you can't even convey your message in proper American English? Third point, behavior. There is one thing to say that Trump perhaps is a fighter. Perhaps Trump is direct. Perhaps he's politically incorrect. Perhaps he is in the America First camp. It's not for me to pass judgment on what America's better interests are. That's for the American leadership and perhaps the public. But the behavior is degenerate. The behavior in terms of how a leader ought to behave in moving a country, in commanding the respect of his or her peers, commanding the respect of other countries, including commanding the respect of your enemies, right? and of course in commanding the respect of future generations of Americans, and indeed other young people around the world who are watching the Americans, as they always do, about how a leader ought to behave with dignity, with reasonable ethics, with good language skills, with oratory, with integrity, right? With a certain sense of dignity and respect for both the office, the institutions, your predecessors, the traditions, the history of America as the great civilization of the last 150 years, to be sure. And therein, again, you have degenerate leadership, which is a tragedy for the American project, and may, in the end, it may be a fatal tragedy. Right? God forbid, because the collapse of the American project would bring many, many projects down with it. Degenerate behavior. There is no leader on earth, totalitarian or democratic, who behaves today as the American president behaves. It is patently degenerate behavior, whatever one's partisan affections. Fourth, American judgment and analytics about the world. They stink. Yeah. Let me just be direct about it. They stink. Who on earth is saying the Americans say that there's a bomb in this country, or there's a project in this country, there's a threat in that country, and the world ought to react, is saying that, well, that should be the authoritative message. American judgment has stunk since the Iraq War of 2003. The biggest mistake after 2003 was the Libya intervention and the killing of Gaddafi, which was not just an ethical, let me put it broadly, an ethical mistake. It was a cataclysm strategically for Europe and led to the election of Donald Trump almost directly through the imagery of mass migration caused specifically by the Libyan bombardment. But thereafter, judgment on Russia, on China, on the Kurdish, Turkish, Syria triangle, on any Middle Eastern question, Iran most significantly, on Yemen, on Venezuela, on North Korea. Who in the world is looking at American analytics and saying, these people know what they're talking about? And just to be clear for my American colleagues, between the three major world power leaders, Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping, who has the best judgment and the best analytical machinery behind them in terms of really being able to pass judgment on what's happening in the world? And the answer must first and foremost be the Chinese and the Russians, and the Americans way behind. Why? Both the Russians and the Americans operate on, the Russians and the Chinese operate on a mental map of about 17 borders. Each country thinking about 17 countries at least at the same time at their borders and receiving analytics and intelligence and top knowledge on them in the respective languages. And America receives it on maximum 2 countries, Canada and Mexico. And the rest is just a function largely of the superior American platforms, which speak to the superiority of American civilization over the last century and a half. Superior American universities, superior publications, superior intelligence assets, but not superior judgment, and not superior language skills, and not superior relationships. And to the extent that these latter 3 or 4 drivers of analytics deteriorate over time, and to the extent that the top receiver of intelligence and information deteriorates over time, the judgment and the analytics become very, very poor. So I find them not impressive at all. Long life to Harvard and Yale and to Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs magazine, but they're highly unimpressive over time as compared to their world competitors in terms of interpreting the world, notwithstanding the fact that America remains a term setter. America runs Twitter, it runs Facebook, it runs Snapchat, Instagram, and it runs this beautiful platform from which I'm profiting and Global Brief is profiting. Thank you for keeping us on, YouTube. But control of the terms and control of the platform does not make for superior content. Last point on Americana and the unfortunate degenerate condition of the American project and American leadership today. The vexing question of guns. This is a domestic matter in the United States, but the response to it betrays the degeneracy of American political leadership and thinking today? Answer me this. Parents of America, parents of the world, and of course parents of Canada. Which country in the world, particularly advanced countries, and even more particularly democratic advanced countries, would ever tolerate more than a single gun massacre over the course of 10 or 15 years, let alone 2 or 3 gun massacres a week? Which country in the world, totalitarian to democratic, backward or advanced, would tolerate a single massacre of children in a school over the course of half a century, let alone 1 or 2 a week, or 3 or 4 a month, with zero correction? And indeed, the perversion of the situation, such that a parent crying for his or her child is drowned out by the degenerate euphoria of those that are crying that this is some manifestation of liberty, of freedom. You know, that children should be slaughtered in school, and that a country should not react by ensuring and correcting. Correcting is the key word, such that this never happens again. Can that be anything other than a degenerate condition in a country? And particularly a country with as educated a leadership as the United States. It is a degenerate condition. And the degeneracy is even more pointed because the swiftness with which these massacres happen, with regular cadence today in the United States, should be juxtaposed in the mind of all American decision makers with the great blood and treasure and love that goes into raising a child, an American child, right? Like every child around the world, there is no society in the world that eats its children. Every society, every civilized society, aims to protect their children until adulthood, at great expense. And it starts with the basic equation that you put so much time into your child. Would you ever allow such a swift and peremptory end to happen? And almost through random probability, as it were. Sorry, those are contradictions in terms. It's almost a question of probability whether these things will happen in American schools or American malls or theaters. This is a degenerate condition, and one that piled on to the other degenerate conditions in American life today really speaks to the decline of the civilized condition in America. I pray that it be reversed. I'm your biggest admirer. Let it happen soon, but let's be honest about where we are.